course, Luke has another volume that he wants to write. Here he pauses, probably coming to the end of a scroll. He's going to write more about the continuation of the church. But the first, the acts of the Lord when he's on the earth are finished, and he'll pause when the acts continue in the early church. Many reasons that we could think of that we should believe in the resurrection. Historical evidences, I like to list those, but realistically, most people don't come to belief because of these 12 reasons. They are good to think about. We have a faith that is intellectually respectable. There are good historical reasons for believing it. But honestly, these alone, in fact, the disciples know all these things and they don't believe, but they are helpful backgrounds for answering skeptics and at least giving a pause for a greater story. So what Luke emphasizes is really a very important point, is if you don't really know why Jesus would be raised from the dead, you're probably not going to believe he actually was raised from the dead. And having a sense of what the story is about, and they didn't understand what the story was about, makes it hard to believe. And so part of the effort of evangelism and apologetics is to explain the story, explain why it was Jesus ought to have raised from the dead. In fact, as Luke tells us, Jesus says, it was necessary for him to die and to be raised again. So those are important. That's important work to do too. But I'd like to just offer 12 historical evidences, or at least partly historical, partly logical, reasons why it's respectable to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. In one sense, it's a bit odd to me that people deny the resurrection from the dead. There are millions of people that believe that life came from chemicals that are mixed in a soup, and somehow that became, some kind of cell, and that cell became an organism. That organism became an animal. Those animals diversified and became all the different things we see. You would think if you have all the elements for life, even if it's dead, that every now and then one's going to come back to life again. If it came from nothing, surely it could come from all the things being there, right? Why would it be so amazing that people would rise from the dead? If you think life came from nothing, it should be easy to believe life came from something that was alive, a day before or 2 days before. But strangely enough, people don't seem to find that very believable. A bit odd, a head scratcher, why it would be hard to believe people come back from the dead every now and then, but people don't believe that. Makes you wonder how you could believe in evolution if you don't believe that resurrections happen every now and then. But anyway, that's a little bit beside the point here. 12 reasons of that I believe it's respectable to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. First, the Gospels and the book of Acts, even by critical ancient historians, have proven to be reliable records of history where testable. So where we can test the Bible, where we can test the Gospels, on every point we've been able to test, the Bible basically is believable. Is that the different scenes it paints, the names, the places it talks about, not that archaeology has proved every single thing, but where it's been tested, the Bible has been proven, which at least tells us that the Gospels were meant to be historical documents. They're not just myths that they're making stuff up. They're not just fables. They are actually trying to tell you history. They name Caesars. They name governors. They name places that they went. They name styles of worship and different customs. And in all the places, what the Gospels present is what every other ancient document says. This is what life was like in the first century. In fact, there was a very interesting, just a kind of a minute study that a woman did about the names in the Gospels. Is that there were Jewish settlements in Palestine, of course, but there were major Jewish settlements in Alexandria, Egypt, and in Rome, and in Syria. And if you go and you list the names from Jews in Alexandria, and you list the names from Jews in Rome and the Jews in Syria, they are not the names of the New Testament. They are completely different names. But when you read the Gospels, they match exactly the kind of names that were in Palestine. In other words, whoever wrote the Gospels knew the kind of people and what they named their children, which is kind of an evidence it was historical. This matches the kind of thing that you would have expected. So whoever wrote it, and there were many Christians Christianity, of course, started in Jerusalem, but it basically grew Syria, Alexandria, Egypt, and Rome. You would think those people would be like, hey, name them after us, if you're going to make up stories, but they didn't make up stories like that. They made up stories that matched the kind of place that these stories actually took place. There, of course, have been skeptics about not every name from the Gospels is in history. People doubted there was even a Roman governor named Pilate. There's no historical record. And then about 1950 or so, they were digging around Caesarea Maritime, that is the Caesarea that's right on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea there in Israel today. They found a stone with an inscription that was honoring Pilate, the prefect of Judea in such and such a year. And they're like, oh, it's exactly what the Bible said. So the Bible, at least we should take it seriously as history. And the details, including things about burial customs and crucifixion, of course, was part of that culture, and it's all been proven in terms of the historical reliability. So we can, of course, test the Gospels at every point. Who knows what somebody said at certain times, but in every way we can test it, the Gospels are historical reliable. We ought to at least give it decent consideration when it tells us something that we can't test, that we are dependent upon eyewitness towards. A second evidence of here would be that there was no prior expectation of a dead Messiah who would come back to life. That's no small point. There were a number of Jewish quasi-messiahs that came up before the time of Jesus that had a great following and were killed and their movement scattered. There were messiahs that came up after the time of Jesus, that they had a great movement and they were all excited, this is the Messiah, he was killed and their movement scattered. And that was about to happen with Christianity too. You can even see it in the Gospels. Even on the road to Emmaus, we thought this was the Messiah, but he wasn't. And they were expecting just to dissolve and, our hopes got up. So what was it that produced Christianity? There wasn't an expectation that there would be a Messiah that was killed or crucified and rose again. It was just not in their frame of thinking. So where did this frame of thinking come from? There were no rabbis. There was no subset of a culture that were hoping for a Messiah that would be killed. In fact, that was exactly what they weren't expecting. Nobody wanted a dead Messiah. They wanted someone to throw off the realm of Rome. That's the way they understood the Bible, and everybody did. There was no prior belief in this theological interpretation of overcoming death and having hope come through an individual Messiah, crucified and raised again. So we have to ask ourselves, where did that belief come from? How did it happen that people started believing this? Since there was now it's true that if you want something to happen, you can make it up or you can imagine it to be so, but nobody was thinking this was not even something that they even desired. In fact, when Jesus is first telling his disciples this, the record's clearly in the Gospels, they rebuked him. This is not the plan. This is not the way it's supposed to happen. So what reversed their view about those things, if not the resurrection itself? It's the best explanation for how their beliefs changed so radically, even if not instantaneously. So related to that, number 3, belief in the resurrection of Jesus involved an enormous theological shift in worshiping a dead man now alive and now considered the Messiah in a radically new way with an entirely new set of theological beliefs. Many of them radically different beliefs than what the Jews had believed before. So if the early church made up the resurrection, you would think they'd have some motivation to do it. What was the theological motivation for making up this story? Judaism was a coherent belief system. They loved their rabbis. They wanted to follow the teaching of their rabbis. They honored their rabbis. Many of their rabbis had changed their lives, and when the rabbis died, they had ways of honoring them. They would name schools after them. They would make plaques to them. That was completely consistent within Judaism. So, okay, there's this new Messiah, or this new rabbi who's teaching things, and now he dies. Most Jews, in fact, all the Jews said, he was a great teacher. None of them said, let's imagine bringing him back to life. None of them said, hey, we loved him so much. They wrote his teachings down, they studied them. So what was it that led to a theological interpretation that this rabbi was absolutely indispensable, that this rabbi cannot possibly die? We have to have this rabbi live. Something happened that caused them to say this rabbi was not like any other rabbi we've ever seen before, and he cannot stay dead. So what is the theology that produces that with all the implied implications of that? And the number of theological changes are rather large. The treatment of women, the education of all people, the release of slaves, the care for the sick in ways the world had never seen before. All these things come as a result of this thing. What is it that happens that produces such a huge change in Judaism to produce Christianity? Well, the best explanation is that the gospel stories are true. That something happened to this Messiah that said we have to rethink our theology. Of course, I'll talk about this in a moment, but including calling a man God. We'll get back to that in a different point. Number 4, the Gospels themselves include problematic material and embarrassing material. If the early church is inventing theological doctrines for whatever purpose they have, their own sectarian purposes, their own ego, their own desire to revolt, why do their heroes look so poor? When people make up stories for themselves, and I don't even need to say people, when you make up stories, you are typically the hero of your story. That's the way we tell stories. We don't tell embarrassing things about us. We hide them in the closet. So why are the dirty laundry of the apostles so prevalent? And the early church needs the apostles to be respected. Christianity is a belief on faith. It's a belief on bedrock faith against all odds. It's faith that's driven against persecution, against temptation. So why do the apostles appear with no faith? They can hardly even understand what Jesus is talking about. They bumble their way through. They're arguing who's the greatest. They are rebuking Jesus and telling him it can't be this way. They betray him at his greatest moments. These are kind of things that are kind of embarrassing for the early church, and yet they're there for all the world to see. Why are they there? Well, probably with humility, the disciples saying, because one, the story is not about us, and it happened. And then, of course, some of the peculiar testimonies about who the key witnesses are. So in the gospel stories, the women are not only the first witnesses, they are the most believing of the witnesses. If there were any heroes in the gospel stories, it's the women. The women don't even seem to doubt. They're like, yes, we believe. Yes, we're devoted. We're following him. They're the only ones that they're at the cross. They're the ones who are at the burial. The disciples, they didn't want to go to the tomb. They're like, they have to be. So the women are the heroes, which of course for us is accepted. But in the first century, women were not even permitted to be official witnesses. They weren't allowed to witness in the court of law. We think it's because when someone's life was on the line, they didn't think women had enough courage to give damning evidence to send someone to execution. We think that's the reason. But anyway, they weren't regarded. So why is it, if you were going to make up a story to try to convince everybody that someone raised from the dead, would you choose women as your star witnesses? In fact, you even see this in the Bible itself. In 1 Corinthians 15, the Apostle Paul is talking about all these people that saw the Lord risen. And he names all the apostles, and he names 500 men, and he doesn't name one single woman. because he's like, no one's going to respect this. So why are the women the heroes of the story? The best reason is because that's what happened. Because they are like, okay, here's what happened. We wouldn't have made it this way. We wouldn't have chosen this way. But those are our star witnesses. And in some respect, it's a backhanded way of saying it must be true. Because why would you make up unlikely or even undesirable witnesses unless it's exactly what had happened? Number 5, the Jews had extreme antipathy to confusing anything with God. Not a bird, not a snake, not any land animal. It was anathema to them to confuse anything with God, and especially any man. And Christianity rises out of this environment where monotheism has triumphed. Now, it's true that back in the times of Elijah and Elisha and there was a lot of ideas about many gods. But by the time of the New Testament, Judaism was extremely monotheistic, to the point of being careful that you didn't even pronounce the name of God wrong. They were concerned about the honor of God. So how is it that these God-fearing Jewish people came to confess a man as God? In fact, even in the New Testament, you can see the New Testament isn't, I wouldn't necessarily say it's shy about it, but it is careful to distinguish that the Father is clearly God and the Son is submissive to him. Yes, he's God, but also with a carefulness saying we want to respect the honor of this Trinity in terms of the exaltation of the Father. So what was it that led these Jewish faithful people to say, we still believe the Old Testament, we don't deny one word of the Old Testament, but we are convinced that this man is also God? How does that happen without something spectacular like, of course, his miracles, but also his prophecy about his death and resurrection actually coming true and verifying his words? Jesus himself, the apostles tell us, was telling them, they said they didn't believe them, they didn't even understand what he was talking about, but when he did, they're like, oh, all the things he said about himself are true, and it's proven by the fact that God raised him from the dead. Number 6, now, it's true there were myths of gods dying and rising, but that's exactly the point. They were myths. The Greeks didn't think that these things were actually history, that these things actually happened. They are ways of explaining the course of nature. You know, the dying of fall and the death and the grave of winter and the coming to life in spring. Now, those were things that, kind of explained how lightning worked and how rain came and why there was droughts and all those different things. So, of course, those things are part of Jewish or Greek mythology and Roman mythology, but they weren't historical events. So imagine in our time, we have the same kind of things. We have Spider-Man, we have Superman, we have Ant-Man, we have all these superheroes, they do these amazing things. But for not 1 second would we believe someone who said, I'm Superman. We wouldn't believe anyone that said, oh, I'm Spider-Man. We would think they, it was Halloween. We would think they were play acting. We wouldn't take anybody seriously. And that's the same thing with the ancient world. They didn't think these gods were actually real. So it's true that in some respects there were gods who lived and died, came to life again. But the Gospels are saying these things actually happened. This is history. We saw it. A lot of people saw it. Now, also, we might say that the Jews were not so patient with the mythology of the Jews with the Greeks and the Romans. And we are talking about a Jewish religion. We're talking about something that came from people that were like, okay, enough of the nonsense of all the mythology. And yet still, it came out of a Jewish context that people said, this God did become man. He did rise from the dead, and he is the center of world history. The resurrection fits and makes sense of that context. Also, we see the change in the disciples in which they talk about themselves. That's recorded about them. So the disciples are somewhat bold on occasion, but for the most part, they are fearful when it matters most. And they are nervous. So what was it that leads them to change from being cowardly and fearful like any of us would be? Okay, if you have something you really believe in, you might die for it. But if you don't totally understand something, you're not going to die for it. Something happens that the disciples become bold. And not just bold, they become exceedingly bold. And their whole demeanor changes and their whole approach changes. So what is it that explains that transition or that transformation of the disciples? The thing that makes the most sense is what they were reported. What they didn't first believe, they began to believe, and it made them bold. Not to mention they believe that death can't hurt us anymore. Because of this promise that death is the least of our concerns, we want to be first right with God. Similar to that is many of the eyewitnesses willingly, in fact even gladly according to the New Testament, suffered and were executed for their testimony as central to faith with no apparent benefit outside of belief. Now here we need to make a distinction. It's true, if somebody thinks something's true and they believe it, they will die for it. That's not what this is. These are people who knew what they were claiming, whether it was true or not. These are the eyewitnesses. When people know something is false, they generally are not willing to spoil their life for it. That if they're going to if they're going to lose their property, they're going to lose their jobs, they're going to lose their family, they're going to get kicked out of the synagogue, they're going to be beaten, maybe 39 beatings with a rod. If you're going to go through all that, would you do it if you knew it was false, like you made up the story? And if you did, why would you do it? Now, you could even maybe slightly imagine if it was peripheral. If it was something that was not central, like it was some side issue, you might say, okay, this isn't true, but the main thing is true. Well, they're dying for the main thing. In fact, they're saying if Christ is not risen, then we shouldn't even follow him. And so they go to their grave, they're in prison, they're ostracized from their family, they're losing their jobs, they're living in poverty. What exactly are they getting out of their testimony if it's not true? So their testimony and the price they pay for it is good evidence that they at least believed it was true. The same thing, in fact, even more dramatically, would be the case of the Apostle Paul, who starts off as an adamant and chief persecutor of the church. He is Phinehas from the Old Testament seeking to wipe out this plague from Jewish religion. He thinks that it's a heresy. He thinks it's going to violate the purity of their religion by teaching this, and he is going to arrest the people and even kill people if necessary. And then the next thing you know, he's on the streets of Jerusalem and Damascus and then Jerusalem and then all over the Roman Empire on the opposite side. He is the one being beaten. He's the one being threatened. He's the one being pursued as the heretic. What is it that changes? Even the most critical scholar has to look at Paul and say, Paul believed that he saw the risen Christ. He went to great lengths to defend it. He changes world history thinking by writing letters about what I saw is the central thing about history. And so what is it that explains that dramatic transformation? An enemy becoming a friend. There's some quirky theories about some psychological mix-up, but is it even believable that someone takes the side of something that they once were convinced? And Paul thought the Bible was against Christianity, but he reread the Bible and then became its greatest advocate. Number 10, the church arose quickly in the context of witnesses and the location of accounts with considerable opposition. Okay, so if you get myths over decades or centuries, that happens, but not when you have eyewitnesses, and not when they are exactly in the place that it happened. Now, you might get something decades later in some other city or some other country, but this all happens right in the very place. So when Peter gets up on the day of Pentecost and says, you know these things, he's talking where Jesus' grave, probably meters away. Probably less than, if anybody wanted, they could have gone and said, here's where he was buried, but nobody could do that. Nobody could say, we know it's not true. The best that the opponents did, which they had many opponents, was to threaten them. They just were like, so, okay, maybe the disciples stole the body, but again, would anybody willingly suffer for something they knew was just a fraud? What exactly were they getting out of it if it wasn't true? So this happens in the context and happens rapidly. The early church forms not century after this, but within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, even within a year or two of the death of Jesus, the church is thriving, not just in Jerusalem, of course, but it's beginning to thrive in other places as well. So the accounts of the resurrection are written, the first of them probably under 20 years, certainly within the lifetime. 1 Corinthians is one of the first books that Paul writes. 1 Thessalonians may be Paul's first letter, and they focus on the resurrection as key to the belief. So in other words, resurrection was not some belief that happened, generations later, but within the theology of the very first followers of Christ, they had a full-blown account of the resurrection. And these accounts are narratives that are kind of messy. If you read the four gospel accounts of the resurrection, they read like eyewitness accounts. They don't read like theological treatises on somebody saying, here's the meaning of the world. In fact, the disciples don't even understand what's happening. And as they're written, even though there's a core set of ideas that happen at the resurrection accounts, they differ from each other. One has one woman, one has multiple women, one has one angel, another one has two angels. There's all these little things that the authors did not get together and say, here's our story. Now, some people think that's a problem. They think it's actually a proof against it. I think it's a proof for it. They are independently written. They all tell the basic same story, and you can kind of work through it. You can kind of sift through it, and you can kind of figure out, okay, if there's two angels, there's at least one. And if there's one woman, or if there's four women, there's at least one. And you can puzzle it out. But they read like eyewitness accounts of someone who's saying, here's what I remember. Now, one thing that you get when you get multiple eyewitness accounts, and I've been in school administration long enough to know this happens, is that when you get people who repeat the exact same thing, you think, oh, they got together and they told you. You can almost always tell when they met together beforehand, and you get certain expressions, and they like, we're going to say this. But when you get different stories, but you can kind of meld them together, you think, oh, I'm probably getting the truth here from different perspectives. Now, it's true, some of the Gospels tell us the guy version of the story, and some of the Gospels tell us the girl version of the story. So, the girls in your family, when they tell a story, it takes like 15 minutes. When the guy tells a story, it takes like 30 seconds. Because girls, they like to tell, they like the drama. Sorry, girls, hopefully I'm not stereotyping everyone, but, kind of generally you get the idea. And so sometimes you get people who like to tell you all the details, and other people who say, enough of all the details, here's the essential thing that happened. So some of the Gospels are like that, and to me that's a support for the trustworthiness of the Gospels. Yes, it can be a little puzzling to figure out when Mary said this and when Joanna and when Peter's there, but you can do it, it's possible. But the writers did not smooth out and prearrange their story. And another thing, they never bothered to take this advantage. Can you imagine if the early church made up the story of the resurrection because they wanted to promote some theological cause? At not one moment of the gospel stories does anybody bother to explain, this means you're going to live forever, or this means that you have hope. It would have been irresistible if you're making up a story to start explaining, like Paul does later in his letters, where he takes the resurrection and he applies it in like 15 different ways. And you're like, wow, that's amazing. Nobody does that in the Gospels. In fact, you're like, what does this mean? The best that Luke does is say, Jesus says, this was necessary to fulfill the Scriptures. And that's all you really get. So I think the best explanation is that they're eyewitnesses who are saying, let's just stick to the facts, and later Paul can explain what all this means, which is basically what Peter, of course, and John do as well in other books. The last thing is probably not is not a direct evidence from history, but the resurrection of Jesus the resurrection itself makes sense of life in a way that I think the human soul really longs for. Because you long for it doesn't necessarily make it true, but at least it makes it desirable. Suffering is miserable. We love our bodies and we hate them. We love life and we fear losing it. We want something to make sense of all the injustice of the world. Can we imagine if Hitler and Mother Teresa and your grandmother and your Aunt Bee, who spend their life doing good, all end up the same? Can you imagine if there's no accounting in bodily life for the world? When Jesus is raised from the dead, the disciples, they go and they preach, the one that you crucified, God has said, your judgment was absolutely wrong. I'm reversing that judgment, and I'm rewarding him with life and eternal life, and I'm making him king of the world. It fits with our bodily life. It fits with our hopes and our dreams. It fits with our sense of justice. It brings so many different elements together. Of course, you have to begin to understand it to see it, but it does make sense of history in ways that if Plato's view was true, that we all are best just spirit beings and our body is evil, it doesn't fit with our view of how we think life should be. We are bodied creatures, and even though the Greeks didn't respect resurrection, the Jews certainly understood something important to us, and that is bodily life is important to creatures like us, and we should honor that. Well, those are 12 reasons that I believe can be supporting of belief. Now, quite honestly, the Bible doesn't necessarily depend upon that. The Bible says you probably won't be saved just by knowing that. But when the glory of Jesus Christ is revealed to your heart, and you see his glory, you'll think, yes, he's my Messiah. He was raised from the dead because God has established this is the way of saving my poor, pitiful soul. That's when belief happens, when it becomes a conviction of the heart that this was good and the glory of God is in it, like 2 Corinthians chapter 4. The God who brought light out of darkness, when he speaks in your heart, that's when we believe. And so while it's good to have historical reasons, even scientific ones, we also need to have the Spirit of God work in our hearts. Let's close our service by...